Okay, so I want to talk a lot about the nature of leadership in terms of how leadership is defined. Okay, so Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of a leader. Leader, according to the dictionary, I'm pointing here, a person who has commanding authority or influence in command or control of others who follow. I'll read that again. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a person who has commanding authority or influence in command or control of others who follow. So it seems here that um, you need a couple of characteristics, right? You need um, control, right? That's what it's command or control. You need followers, right? And you need authority, which I would say authority is similar to that concept of control, right? You need authority, you need control, you need followers. So maybe we narrow this down. So according to Merriam-Webster, what I'm trying to perhaps suggest is if we analyze that, to argue with Mr. Merriam and Mr. Webster, at least from a Jewish perspective, that leadership is much more nuanced than that. And I want to use some examples from Jewish history to showcase my thesis. Let's start with Pinchas. Okay? Pinchas was someone who had been pushed away from leadership, right? He was from a Kohanic family, he was from a Kohen family, but since he was born before the Kohen status had been established, he was not in line of succession for the role of priesthood. After he took extremely decisive action, he was then offered what's called a Brit Shalom, and he was offered the role of a leader as a Kohen. Now let's look, and by the way, if we follow the Midrashim, that leadership is one of the longest lasting leadership because Pinchas's personality is juxtaposed onto Eliyahu and Avi. And there's a lot of connection between Pinchas and Eliyahu. And so you have Pinchas and Eliyahu, in that sort of, narrative arc that goes on for a very long time. So the connection is very, very deep. And so that's a really long spate of leadership if you think about all the things Eliyahu did and how we have Eliyahu still in our lexicon today. But let's look carefully at the story of Pinchas. That's right here. Ve'elazar ben Aaron lakach lo mibnot Putiel lo liisha. Elazar, the son of Aaron, married from the Bnot Putiel. Vaten lo Pinchas, and that was the son of Pinchas. Now, why is that important? It's the lineage of Pinchas. So the lineage of Pinchas is important because the next part of the story, right? Pinchas was not a well-known figure in the Bible until at the end of the previous parsha before Pinchas, right? In the end of Parshat Balak, he takes this action and he kills Cosby and Zimri, kills the people who are the bottleneck, so to speak, of the plague, and the plague stops, is a good pacifist. So, what happens to Pinchas? He takes this decisive action that essentially catapults him to eternal, almost, Jewish leadership. And what happens? Remember we said he's called Benot Putiel. He's from the Putiel dynasty. Says the Gemara in Sanhedrin. After Pinchas took this action, they say, Re'item ben Putizeh. Remember Putiel? What's ben Puti? Ben Puti is Ben Shepitem Avi Imo Agalim Lavodah Zarah. What happened after Pinchas did his act that changed the course of Jewish history? The rest of the Jewish people mevazimoto. They denigrated him. And they said, you're from Bnot Putiel. Puti comes from the word patem, which means to fatten lambs for idolatry. They said, you, Yehareg Nasim Yisrael, you are going to kill a prince of Israel? So they made fun of him and yelled at him, denigrated him, and made fun of his lineage. When you think what he did should be celebrated. And therefore, why does it say that God gave him the covenant of peace? The reason was he needed peace because the rest of the Jewish people were rising up against him and were absolutely denigrating him and describing how terrible he was. So Pinchas is a leader who absolutely lacked any command or control. He commanded no one. He controlled no one. And yet, Pinchas is morphed into Eliyahu, and he's a leader. Think about his successor, Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi, the same thing. Eliyahu Hanavi single-handedly transformed the time of Jewish history, the time of the king Achav. You know Ahab from Moby Dick, so that's the Hebrew of that is Achav. King Achav was, and his wife Jezebel, right? His wife Jezebel were in the Book of Kings totally destroying the moral and religious fabric of the Jewish people, and single-handedly, as one man, Eliyahu Hanavi stood. You may remember the famous story of he stood on Mount Carmel and he had this showdown, against the priests of the Baal, the idolatry. And Eliyahu is always known as a solitary figure. And immediately after, he had to run for his life, and he writes, "Ve'ishaer ani livadi," I am on my own. So you can be a leader without command or control. His position was mocked by others. And that is a very powerful aspect of leadership, which does not require command, control, or followers. Even though we say in Melech Baloam, we'll get to that a little bit, but their fundamental ingredients of leadership do not need to have command or control of others. Pinchas absolutely did not. In many ways, Eliyahu did. We'll bring another example, but I see Miriam has a question. Let me unmute you, Miriam. 1 second. It's not unmuted. I need you to do it on your end. And one more time. Let me just, there we go. Okay, we can hear you now, Miriam.
I don't mean to interrupt. It's just a quick question, because while you're talking about Eliyahu, before we go on to Pinchas, which you're making a very interesting point, was it Eliyahu? I don't remember. Was it Eliyahu who said to Achav, "Haratzachta v'gam yarashta"?
Yeah, that's the story about the Navala Carmeli. Yeah, it's a Navala Carmeli. That's a story before what we're talking about. Ratzachta v'gam yarashta, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's Sorry. Yeah. All right, amazing. Okay, so let's move on to another example of, I would call it, non-Websterian leadership, meaning not filling with what Webster says. And I think it's a really interesting example, the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad. The daughters of Tzlafchad, just to remind you of the story, their father died. They had no brothers. At that time, it was not clear what the path to inheritance was between men and women. And they went to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe wasn't sure. They had to come to God about what type of inheritance they would get in the land of Israel after the Jewish people entered after their sojourn in the desert. And so there was a formula that was given to the Benot Tzlafchad. They said, listen, our father died. We had nothing to do. Well, we don't know if we get married to someone outside of our tribe, there'll be an issue of our movement of our father's inheritance to somewhere else, etc. What are we even allowed to? A whole discussion. But the core principle that was mentioned in the daughters of Tzlafchad's story is they said to him, I should say, they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Tinu lanu achuzah, we don't want to lose out because of these unclear rules having to do with inheritance of our inheritance in the land of Israel. Now, look at the Yalkut Shimoni. Yalkut Shimoni is the Midrash, right here where my mouse is. Hopefully you can see it. And the Yalkut Shimoni makes a very interesting, what I'll call chronological point, meaning about the chronology. The way the story of Benot Tzlafchad comes according to the Yalkut Shimoni is immediately following the story of the spies. And the spies were all men. They riled up the Jewish people, other than two of them, to break the Jewish people's morale and excitement about going into the land of Israel. And they said, after the story of the spies, the Jewish people as a whole said, Nitna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayma. Let's turn around our heads, so to speak, change our direction and go back to Egypt. The Yalkut Shimoni says something really interesting. It says the Torah is giving us a hint to never just look at any story. You got to look at its context, not just its content. You got to look at its neighbors, so to speak. When you see a story in the Torah, you got to see what was its neighbors around. What other stories happened in juxtaposition? And so the Yalkut Shimoni says, Tana lanu achuzah, when it's talking about the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad, says, let's compare the narrative we hear from men and the narrative we hear from women. All right, I will simply just share with you what the Yalkut Shimoni says. Yafeh koach nashim mikoach hanashim. The power of what the narrative we hear from men is far inferior to the narrative we hear from women, because just weigh one against the other here. Yafeh koach nashim. The power of women is greater than the power of men. Anashim omrim. What do the men say? Nitna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayma. Let's turn around, drop all this thing called the Jewish destiny, and head back to Egypt. Nashimom wrote, now let's think the context about how important the daughters of Tzlafchad's statement was. Tana lanu achuzah. You see, the zeitgeist of that time, the popular public opinion at that time was, drop this whole thing about Jewish destiny. The tide was turning of everybody claiming, let's go back to Egypt. So, if you just hear the Benot Tzlafchad say, well, we want an inheritance, you think that. But now think about it in context. In a time where all the newspaper headlines are screaming, we're on a death trap, everybody turn around, go back to Egypt. You have a solitary voice of the daughters of Tzlafchad who say, not only do we want, should we stay on path, give us more connection to the land. Strengthen our legs. And imagine in the middle of a swarm, a sea of people screaming, let's not go. They're saying, give us more. Give us a stronger connection. So just think about the concept of Tanu lanu achuzah, Tana lanu achuzah, please give us a stakehold, a stake in the land of Israel, is not just a request, but it's a request in the context of going against the tide, right? So if Pinchas exemplified leadership without control, right? Pinchas controlled no other, but Tzlafchad showcased leadership without any followers. No one was following. They were saying, let's go this way, and everybody else saying, go that way. No one was following the daughters of Tzlafchad. They were literally saying, let's go in the opposite direction of everybody else. No followers, and yet they're leaders, right? Leadership wasn't about having others follow. It was about you following your convictions, right? Leadership is following your convictions, your values, living the best way you know how. And leadership is less about followers and more about fortitude, right? It's about being confident about what's right, even if it isn't what's championed by the masses. So again, this is another aspect of going against the definition. And by the way, this is exemplified by the name Avraham HaIvri. Why is Abraham called Avraham HaIvri? Because that he was leadership. He was literally what I would call iconoclastic leadership. Iconoclastic leadership means you are leading by going against the grain. Avraham me'ever echad, he was ivri, from the word aver, meaning side. He was on one side and everybody else on the other side of worshiping idols. And Avraham was like, no, let's think differently. And Avraham's the leader. So again, we're not ignoring the fact that leadership implies a certain sense of control and following, but the idea of its focus is not the control. It's not the following. If leadership's focus is about power, is about getting power and control, then it's not what we learn from Pinchas, what we learn from Eliyahu, it's what we learn from the daughter Tzlachah, what we learn from Avraham Avinu. Right? It can include those things, but it can't be about those things. And I would say the last very powerful example of this reimagined definition of leadership is from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is, we would call him the quintessential Jewish leader. If you had to pop up a name of a Jewish leader of Jewish history off your head, 9 times out of 10, my guess is that the first person to come to your mind would be Moses. Now, let's go a little bit back in Moses' career. To the time, in the end of the book of Shemot, not the end of the Parsha of Shemot, when he's having a conversation with God. It says the following. Moses come back to God, and if you remember just the context of the end of the book of the Parsha of Shemot, it's a time of pretty dire times for the Jewish people. Right? It's very bad times for the Jewish people. They have been literally, everything has gotten worse. Right? They had asked to leave, and instead they got more work with less support. So Moshe comes back to God and he says, why have you made it worse? You brought harm upon these people. Why did you send me? And from the time that I've come to Pharaoh to speak in your name, God, the only thing that's gotten changed for these people has gotten worse. And you, God, have not saved your people. Skip to the next words. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God responds to Moshe. So don't worry, Moshe. I'll take care of business. You shall soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He shall let them go because of a great might. Indeed, because of a great might, he shall drive them from his land. And then continue Parshat Va'era. Vayomer Elokim el Moshe. Vayomer Levani Hashem. Right, that I have appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and did not myself make known to them by my name Hashem. Okay. Now, this is a very cryptic passage. I'll just recap what happens in this passage. What's happened in this passage is that Moses has approached to God, has said to God, how dare you, God, make it worse for these people? You haven't fulfilled your promises. You haven't done da. I have two questions about Moses' response. The first question about Moses' response is, why is he surprised? Moses was told just a couple of chapters before by God, this is exactly what's going to happen. God told him at first, Pharaoh's not going to let them go. And then it's going to get all right. But at first, Pharaoh would not allow them to do what you asked them to do. So Moshe's coming depressed and angry and you know, emotional about something that he knew was going to happen ahead of time. This is very strange that Moshe's coming and complaining against God when God said this is exactly how it was play out. So that's my first issue that I wanted to try and raise. The second issue to raise is, did Moses not realize with whom he was speaking? Right? If you think about the burning bush, all Moses was about, I can't do this, it's too much. He was very timid. He's a kvad peh. Now suddenly, he's turning to the King of Kings, the Master of the world, and speaking with him like he's rebuking him. Right? Listen to what he's saying. Is this the way you talk to the Melech Malchei Amlachim? Why did you send me? Why did you bring harm? Every time I've done, imagine what you're saying. Every time I've followed you, you've made it worse. You haven't delivered, God. That doesn't seem to be the kind of way that you speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? One of the key principles of Jewish, the Jewish approach is faith. Where's Moshe's faith? Especially, like I said, when he knew this was going to happen. So, in fact, if you look at the Talmud, Sanhedrin is perplexed by this and says that's why God invokes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had trials and tribulations, and none of them questioned God the way Moshe did. So, it's just a really perplexing story. Moshe knew this was going to happen, and even if he didn't, where's his faith? So take a look at the Midrash Rabbah. The Midrash Rabbah gives a totally, unbelievable approach that is at once extremely simple, at the second very, very powerful. Says the Midrash Rabbah. He's talking about the power of what's called sanegoria. The sanegor in a court case is the defense attorney. Somebody who is trying to be melamed zchut shomim, to try to remove an indictment, to try and move judgment positively about somebody. So umisha lomed sanegoria al Yisrael, somebody who again tries to offer positive judgment and try to engender positive judgment on the Jewish people. Af shemidaber dvarim kashim. Ein adam nitpas al tzaro. Even if this person is speaking harsh words, no one is held culpable. Because it says, Biksha midat hadin, mem dalad hey dalad. Midat hadin lifgoa b'Moshe. Now, let's look really carefully at the words of the verses that we read. Right? Moshe speaks in this, I don't know whether they say chutzpah to God. And what does it say here? When God responds, Vayomer, the name of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the name of Hashem El Moshe. This name, this appellation of God responds to Moshe. That's known as Midat Hadin. Midat Hadin is the attribute of God, so to speak, of justice, of punishment, of harshness, of, and it sounds like, according to the Midrash Rabbah, God was turning to Moshe and saying, we don't talk that way, right? In a sense of rebuke. And so that's what it says, Biksha midat hadin lifgoa b'Moshe. There was a sense that the attribute of justice, this was going to attack Moshe, because that's not the way we speak. Again, especially when, you could say that Moshe might not have had logic on his side. However, and this is the most powerful line, Ulefi shenistakel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When God saw Shebishvil Tsar Yisrael Diber Cain, that because of what was causing Moshe to speak that way? Because of the pain of the Jewish people. Then what happened? Chazar v'nahagimo b'midat harachamim. What do you see the next pasuk? Vayedaber Elokim. That's the name of God of Rachamim, of mercy. In other words, What is the Torah saying? Torah saying is that what was going on here? Did Moshe have a logical argument? You could argue not. Is man supposed to speak with the chutzpah to God? Absolutely not. And that's the idea the Torah is teaching us, that there's this sense of such behavior likely engenders the midat hadin. However, God says, I don't just look at what's going on, I look at behind the scenes, what's the context? And the context is Moshe's not speaking out as a logical orator, as a a professor elucidating a argument. He's crying out in pain because he feels the pain of the Jewish people. Now, was Moshe actually physically laboring? No. Did Moshe need to go and gather extra wood or straw to build bricks? No. But God saw that Bishvil Tsar Yisrael. Moshe, I had a teacher in Israel who always would say, Kishikoev so'akim. When it hurts, you cry out. And that's what Moshe was doing. Moshe was crying out with this visceral solidarity. My people are hurting, so I'm hurting, so God help them. That's what Moshe was doing. And when God realized, then all bets are off. No midat haracha, no midat hadin. Now God says, you care about my people so much so that you will have this kind of outburst, and I understand the outburst. And you would say, Moshe must have realized that his most precious possession, his relationship of the closest man who ever could interact with God, could be on the line when you speak like this. And Moshe said, for my people, I'll do anything. Moshe adds a new aspect of leaders. Yes, we learn from Bnei Slavchan and Pinchas and some of the others, it's not necessarily inherently about having followers. In fact, what is it really about? It's about you following the needs of the people. There's a term, I think it's called servant leadership, where the leader may end up with the most power, but sees him or herself as the servant. Look at the pasuk later in the story of Moshe. After the Jewish people sin, and he goes to God and he demands, again, he speaks with almost impunity to the King of Kings, and he demands, God, you better forgive that. Va'ata im tisa et chatotam, God, please bear their iniquity, which means forgive them. Here's verse 4 where the mouse is. V'im, and if you don't forgive them, mechenina misefercha. What kind of a threat is this? Erase me from your book. Now, interesting. What does he say? It doesn't say erase them. It says erase me from your book. Look at the commentary of Rabbi Moshe Alshich. It says, Shetitol oti lekaparatam, take me as their atonement. That's what Moshe says. I hope to try and put myself in harm's way to make sure that the Jewish people are okay. Basically, I want to make sure that I'm the one gets in trouble and not them. Listen to the Ktav HaKabbalah of the Rav of Mecklenburg. If God, you can't find some place in your being, in your heart, so to speak, to find some way to forgive them, mecheni, erase me. Shelo yizkor shmi b'fnei briot leolam. Lo yeh noda l'dorot habaim she'iti ro'el lebeit Yisrael me'anigam kilo levracha yeh b'einai dorot atidim. If you can't forgive them, then what's my leadership worth? I don't want to be known as a leader of the people who I couldn't save them when they needed to be saved. Ma'asi mahem larik, that my engagement with them was for naught. Larik, from the word rake, empty. He's like, I'm asking for something which makes no sense, Moshe says. Moshe did no sin. How could his name be erased? It was just a method to come to his real request, which is that God forgive the Jewish people. Again, putting himself, he didn't say erase them, erase me. As long I want to be in their place, not to punishment. And I've quoted this many, many times. You've probably heard it from me, but this is, I'd say, the most powerful aspect of the aspect of Moshe's leadership. The Piyutei Shmini Atzeret. Shmini Atzeret, we sing certain songs. I don't know, hopefully we'll be able to sing them this year. Asking for rain. And I'll read it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it into English. It says, Zechor hanolad b'bsorot yukach namayim. It's a poem that what it does is, I'm sorry that my speaker here keeps moving. I just want to be able to look in the camera and see everybody. It's a poem that talks about. Sorry, it keeps moving. I apologize. It talks about different stories and different people from Jewish history, and uses their zechut, their merit, to ask for God to give us rain. It talks about Abraham, Yitzchak, Moshe, and then it talks about Moshe. Zechor, God, please remember. Hanolad v'vsorat yukach na'mat mayim. V'shachta lehoro l'sachato l'shipuch damo kamayim. The Yaakov Avinu, for example, that Yitzchak Avinu. He was born. It's connected to the phrase "Yukach na'mat mayim," that there be a little bit of water. That's a story that Abraham said when the angels came, and so and he ended up almost getting shechted like water. Zihir gamhu leshuach lev kamayim. He was one who poured out his heart in prayer to God. Chafar Matzah, later in his life, he dug wells of water. So he's deeply connected to water. And B'tzidko, based on his righteousness, Chon Chashras Mayim, please fill the lack of water, meaning give us rain. So that's the model of this poem that we quote important figures from Jewish history and say, in their merit, please give us water. Now listen to Moshe. God, please remember, Mashui B'tevat Gomem min Hamayim. He was brought out with a basket of reeds from the water. That's Moshe Rabbeinu. Namo na dalo dala vishkatzon mayim. Right? He brought out the wells of water to give the Jewish to give his flock. Segulecha, when your people ate samulamayim, when they were thirsty for water, what did he do? Al haselahach. He hit the rock, and water came out. Now, something's wrong with this poem. Something's wrong with this picture, right? Because what this poem is meant to do is quote all these great things that our leaders in history did, and say, just like Yitzchak Avinu was willing to go to the Akedah, in his merit, please bring water. Why on earth would we quote the blackest mark, so to speak, on Moshe's record, when he hit the rock, to ask for God to remember that positively? That's the one thing we shouldn't bring up. When you go to court, you talk and you try to argue on behalf of a client. If you're an attorney going to court, you quote about their good works and you quote about their great charity, and you talk about how they help the needy, and you don't mention the one time that they forgot to pay their parking ticket. Right? Why would you talk about the black mark that they did? So the Master Victory, I don't have it here, has a powerful explanation. He says, why? Because what was going on in the time where God hit the rock, where Moshe hit the rock? The Jewish people had complained and were, again, I would say, getting on God's last nerve. And what happened? Moshe hits the rock. And the Talmidei Rashi, the students of Rashi in the Master Victory explain, says, what was going on? Moshe hit the rock. so punishment would go on him and not on them. He tried to diffuse or redirect God's wrath on him. So his hitting of the rock was essentially a mistake that put his own future on the line, and he lost his greatest desire to enter the land of Israel just to make the Jewish people be okay. Redirect God's wrath against the Jewish people. So that we're saying, Moshe's leadership was epitomized by selflessness. And that we're saying is a great zechut, a great merit to allow for the Jewish people to receive rain. What kind of a tzaddik of a leader did we have, Moshe Rabbeinu? How he is remembered is not Manhigenu or Malkeinu, he is our teacher. And so Moshe, again, is putting himself in harm's way to make sure that the Jewish people, that's the idea of Moshe is not a leader with followers, and Moshe is the one who goes behind the people to prop them up. That's the concept. That's the aspect of leadership. And so I would say that we can redefine leadership based on what we're learning in these examples. The concept of the daughters of Tzlachah. You can go in the opposite direction of everybody else and be a leader. The concept of Pinchas. You can control no one except yourself and be a leader. The concept of Moshe Rabbeinu, who, by the way, his leadership started when no one was looking, when there was one Egyptian hitting a group of Jews, and he stepped in. Your leadership is not about standing in front of multitudes of people. Your leadership is about inspiring by showing how much people matter to you. Leadership is about caring. And so it's not about, you may have authority, you may have influence, you may be in control or in control, you may have followers, but leadership is about these things, about pushing forward, pushing the people. Again, so I would say that there's a concept of very, very powerful, I would say, inspiration through halacha. And by the way, when it talks about political leadership in the Parshat Matot, when you have the leaders of the tribes, you know what the leaders of the tribes are? The Torah says the halacha is you must teach the leaders of the tribes the concept of the rules of Nidarim. Why? Because the leaders of the tribe are meant to be role models. In fact, the greatest leader is always the king. And the Torah says the king, the concept of the king always has to have a Sefer Torah on his arm because he needs to show what he has allegiance to. The king is about showcasing and role modeling. Yes, there's a great grandeur of being a king, but it's the grandeur about the people that you represent, not about yourself. That's why you have the Sefer Torah to remind him of that he represents those who are servants of God. And so I would say that it's a very important time when we think about all the rules and the requirements of leadership, that the concept of making sure that the commanding authority, the influence, the command and control, the followers are not, they may be elements that occur when you are a leader, but they're not what make you a leader. And in that regard, we'll have to stop a little bit earlier today, but in that regard, I would say that as we look towards lots of discussions about people in leadership roles, maybe they aren't necessarily those who are in the front of the podium, those who have the spotlight on them, may have some of the trappings that come along with leadership, but the people who are taking care of their family, people who stand when someone needs help, people who look after or role model chesed, whether or not they have authority, influence, or followers, they are leaders. And I would say that expands our notion of leadership and offers us, in this time, I think, something that has great potential. And I would say the last point is people think you can't have leadership when you are always distanced from everyone else. Because who's going to follow you? You can't even go near each other, only on Zoom. I would say now is a time for a resurgence of this truer and deeper definition of leadership, which I think is applicable to all of us. I want to wish everybody a great Shabbos. Once again, just a reminder, no class tomorrow. I'm sorry, no class next week, and we look forward to seeing everybody coming forward. All right, I'll let me just undo the stop recording.